Okay. Well, hello.
Hi.
Welcome, everyone. We are going to, through the magic of the screen, I'll be presenting soon. I just have to coordinate which of my screens I'm going to be sharing. So everyone should now see a full screen. Are we seeing that?
No,
Just,
How about now?
yes,
there we
yes.
go.
Um,
So Jay, as you're setting up, if it's all,
Sure.
let's see. Oh, darn. It's still unable to detect my camera. So if I can just say that the Polish American Cultural Institute of Minnesota, PACIM, is hosting this talk. And it's a result of a Polish Family Stories group. We have a group on Tuesday, first Monday of the month, theoretically at 7 p.m. and by Zoom. And if it's nice weather, then we'll meet in person at the office. But that's sort of open to travel schedules and various things. So basically, we are delighted to have Jay speak. Jay has spoken in our group about genealogy research, and it has been very illuminating. So we will hear from him about his experience and a number of resources. And I'm really looking forward to this, and we may have him speak again. So there you are. Jay, I'm really excited to hear what you have to say, and I welcome all of you to join us in Polish Family Stories group, first Mondays of the month.
Glad to be here. Thank you very much. And welcome to spring. Even though it's under 60 degrees and 50 miles an hour wind, but hey, we'll take whatever we can get. It's not snow, right?
Yeah.
As I was introduced, I am Jerome Vincent Biedny. I've been involved in genealogy really since I was 12 years old, working on the Boy Scout merit badge for genealogy. I'm 100% Polish from both sides of my family, even though I am fourth generation American, depending on what side. So all my relatives came from the Poznan area and Galician areas of Poland. I have a few Russian partition people as well, but they all came from Poland between 1880 and 1910 to Buffalo in New York. And Buffalo had quite a active Polonia. So my parents, who are also 100% Polish, obviously married, and myself and my four siblings are a product of that. So I've also been a member of the Polish Genealogical Society of New York, which is headquartered in Buffalo, and the Polish Genealogical Society of America, which is headquartered in Chicago, because my roots are back east. And then I've also been on the board of the Polish Genealogical Society of Minnesota ever since I moved here over 30 years ago. And I've been had the pleasure of being the past president of that organization. So these are my parents, Betty and Jerry. I start all presentations with them because without them, I wouldn't have anybody to dig up. So, so there is something called the Sweet 16. So you, it would be your 16 great-great-grandparents. And for my mother, I know all but one of her 16 great-great-grandparents. And for my father, I know a little bit less of his. I know 14 of his. But when I got to knowing my Sweet 16, I realized it was time to sit down and write up my family history And I'm working with a publisher now, and it should be out this summertime. So that's a whole nother discussion about how to actually publish a family history. But today we're really going to be talking about records available to us in America and back in Poland, where you don't have to necessarily get on a plane to go there to search the records. I left this slide up a little bit because we're going to see two people over and over again in some of the examples today. That is my mother's father and my father's father. So Stanley Biedny and John Fida. So Stanley and John are going to be reoccurring themes in my discussions today. So have you found your church yet? The key to unlock all the records in Poland, at least for the 1800s, if you are a peasant and not a landowning part of the population, is to find the church records. And they weren't all destroyed during the war, no matter what they tell you. And now that people have a little more time on their hands in Poland, the archives are becoming more online, and all sorts of interesting records are coming online and just to light daily. So it's a wonderful time to be able to do research in Poland. So just a note about sources. People keep all sorts of records. Some of them are very valuable for genealogists, and yet they never were intended to be kept. So there is hope. If you didn't think you knew something, depending on the research method you use, you can always find a little bit more. So in American sources, looking at American sources, again, we're going to try to focus on finding that village name. Sometimes you'll see a city or a town, but chances are you did not actually come from that city or that town. You came from a small village near there because most people were escaping a agrarian life that had gotten difficult. So, but you want to cast a wide net. If you don't find specific information on your direct family lines, broaden it a little. Look for friends, look for associates, neighbors in the census, people that lived in the same home, maybe rented from each other. Those are the kinds of things that you might have to widen before you find that small village. And then start with what you think you know and work back. And why I say think, lots of stories are told, and you can't treat the stories as gospel. So when I started out in this many, many years ago, I would keep my records in pencil, and I would write over the pencil in blue ink when I received an actual paper document that backed it up. Even if it was my own birth certificate, I had as pencil for a while until and then if I found two documents that backed up the same fact, then I wrote over it in black marker. So then you knew that it was good. And obviously quoting where you found the information, citing your sources is a whole nother topic we could spend a half a day on. So I won't get into that. But what you want to deal with is quality over quantity. It's better to find 2 or 3 people that you're really related to than 5 or 6 that the internet tells you you're related to. So there are lots of information out there that gets misrecorded and then copied over and over and over again. So you want to spend the time to find the real information, then you know at least yours is correct. So in the world of genealogy, there are kind of 3 categories of sources. There are primary sources, secondary sources, and actually it's called tertiary sources, but I call them stabs in the dark on this presentation. It's a little more dramatic. Okay, so primary sources. Primary sources are recorded at the time of the event by a first-hand witness to the facts. They're serious, they're official, they're not exactly rock solid, but at least they're less wrong. So a couple of examples of that would be birth, marriage, and death records. Birth, of course, and marriage are more reliable than death records because death records are being recorded about a person that's dead by their next of kin, and that could be a grandchild or it could be a wife, and even the wife doesn't remember all of the stuff when people die. Naturalization papers and ship's manifests, those were done at the time and by the federal government, so that information tends to be much more solid. There are also military records, especially for Polish immigrants that hadn't naturalized. There was the World War I draft cards and World War II draft cards. We'll get into that in a little bit. And then there is DNA results. There's 3 different companies doing that now. I'll briefly touch on that. And then there are other places to find information like the Social Security Death Index and court records and other information, but we'll be focusing on the ones that are in bold here. So here is a death certificate of Stanley Biedny. He died in 1925. He died in Buffalo in an industrial accident. All his life, he shoveled coal into different ovens. First, he worked at a bakery, then he worked at a brick company and a steel mill. And when he was working at the brick company, there was an explosion in the furnace, and he received pieces of brick in his neck, and it got infected, and he died. And I remember my grandfather telling the story about how my great-grandfather said, "I'm not going to the hospital because that's where expensive place for people to die." So he died. But this kind of record has lots of information. It does not specifically speak to the town in Poland, but there is a place for that here, birthplace, city or town. There is a line there. Quite often, people didn't fill it out if they didn't know exactly what it was, but it did list his parents, Anton Biedny, and his wife there, and we have more information about them coming up. But it is one opportunity. There is a line right there, and sometimes you find the town name right on the death certificate, if somebody in the family knew the information. Here we have, so this death certificate, I knew I needed, so I sent to the city of Buffalo, and they have a historical section, which is not in City Hall. It's in another completely different building. And any record that is older than 75 years, you need to send to this other place. So I sent for this record, and the gentleman said, "Well, would you like Sophia's death notice?" And I said, "Sophia? I don't know any Sophia, and nobody ever talked about a Sophia." And they said, "Well, it's at the same address, and this is my grandfather's sister." My grandfather never talked about a Sophia because she died very young, and he was only about 6 years old. So he never even thought of bringing it up. But the death notice from 1914 had her infant death in it.
Can you interrupt you for a minute, because somebody waiting to be admitted to the meeting. Can you, because you are the host now, so.
Okay, let me see. Normally it would pop up on my screen, right?
Yeah, it should pop up right then. It's Paul. I don't know who.
Pause, stop, disable, all right.
No.
Participant, waiting room. Paul, okay, Paul, you're in now. Are you with us now, Paul? Paul, have you joined? Okay, I may actually, the machine may have him on mute because all of the people are probably on mute unless they unmute themselves. Okay, so this is death records. We were talking about death records. So this is a great piece of information. So this is naturalization papers. So many Americans, many Poles, when they came to America, they wanted to make some money and hopefully return, buy a farm in Poland and retire there, because it's obviously cheaper to live in Poland than it was in the United States. But many people found, especially with the onset of First World War, they didn't have an opportunity to go back to Poland. And then after the war, there was a lot of strife and people weren't going back, they stayed. So in the 1920s and 30s, people had decided to get naturalized, and it was a process that took usually about 5 years. You had to file what was called first papers, and the first papers were the declaration papers that said you wanted to become a citizen. Then you had to live in a certain area and then come back 5 years later, and in front of a judge and witnesses, you took the oath of office, so you were naturalized. This is Stanislaus Biedny, my great-grandfather's naturalization papers, and through it, his whole family is listed and his wife is listed. And in the naturalization papers, it stated the town they came on and the ship they came on. So here is one of those declaration papers. It's for my other grandfather, John Fida, and John comes from Kruszczowo in Galicia, Austria. So the town name is right there. It also mentions that he came on Kaiser Wilhelm II, the ship Kaiser Wilhelm II, and it gives the date that he landed. So you can also work information back through that. In America, we are actually one of the few countries where you are a citizen by birth on American soil. That goes back well over 200 years because we were a small population and a huge country, and they wanted to make sure that it was easy to become a citizen. So they have not changed that. Many European countries, Switzerland comes to mind, it's very difficult to become a citizen. Your parents could become citizens, and you wouldn't necessarily become a citizen immediately of Switzerland. There's all sorts of rules about it because they're trying to limit the amount of people that come to Switzerland. So they have different rules. But naturalization in America, you can do it by paperwork like this, or simply be born here in the United States. This is John Fida's record of coming to the United States on the Kaiser Wilhelm. So this is the manifest list. This says Kaiser Wilhelm, and the page, there's actually a whole nother page next to this that I didn't have. And you will see that on line number 11, there is this man named Wojciech Fuda. Well, this should be Fida, and his first name is not Wojciech. It has always been John. He signed his name John all his life, but this was misrecorded. The good part is those naturalization papers showed me that he came on this ship. So I know he came on this ship, and then this name has been misused in the past and misspelled. It's been spelled Fuda with a U. It's been spelled Fida with an I. It's been spelled Fada, F-A-D-A. So it's this corruption that we go back to. Something interesting about John is he was detained. So here is again, Wojciech Fuda. And again, if you don't understand how the old cursive writ, if you were American and you were putting this into a computer program, you might say this is Duda, D-U-D-A, because this capital doesn't look like an F, but it is an F. Anyways, Wojciech, I will go back here. There's a star by his name, and the star means to check at the very end of the list. And at the end of the list is the record of detainees for the Kaiser Wilhelm II. So the person that was supposed to pick him up was not there at the dock. So he was detained at Ellis Island for 1 day. And this is a record of, he had to pay. He had to pay for the food that he had overnight in his overnight stay. But someone came and picked him up the next day. So this is the interesting information you can find. And this is John. See, he's always signed his name John. He's always signed it F-Y-D-A. But because he was misrepresented on the paperwork from the ship, the it is filled out as FUDA on the paperwork, but he always signed it as FYDA. He's been a FIDA all his life. All the records in Poland are from that town are FYDA. So just showing you how different things change. This was in the newspaper just recently. So it's the Tin Man is sitting here, and this says Ancestry.com DNA results, and it has 5% tuna fish can and 10% soup can and 25% aluminum foil and 5% tinsel and 38% oil drum and 18% funnel. So I put this here as kind of an introduction to genealogical work. Now, genealogical DNA, it is a first level primary source. It certainly is. I mean, there's no way to fake your DNA. However, unfortunately, in today's day and age, I have my DNA on 3 different websites, and most of the time I get inquiries at the 3rd cousin level, which means you share a 4th grandfather. Now that's pretty far back. To have a 4th grandfather, you have to be as diligent in your paperwork as I have been. And I'm telling you, most people, kids under 30 years old, they go on these websites because they want their, I call it the pie chart of genealogy. They just want the pie chart of what percentage of what countries they come from. They're not really willing to do the extra searching that you need to compare your last names to their last names. You might get a region, but other than a region of the country, you can't go by an actual connection unless you're talking about having the research done for the last names. So again, there is I'm on 23andMe. That's the one that I've been on the longest. My heritage is it's based in Israel, but it draws on a lot of European information. And then, of course, Ancestry.com got into it about 10 years ago. They have the largest database. They have the most whiz-bang information. But before you spend $99 to do the test, wait for Father's Day or Mother's Day, because they always have sales, and it's usually like $60. So, and it's totally anonymous. They don't know who you are. They don't care. You get a number, and they send you back the results as a number. And so it's very, people aren't mining your data, but it is another way in this day and age to be able to find people. I did find a gentleman who was very close to me in the Buffalo area. He was in his 80s, and he's now since passed away, but he was adopted. So someone from my family had given up someone for adoption at some point, but he could not connect the dates and the ages because he didn't have that information. It was closed adoption in New York State, so he was never able to find who his natural parents were. But very interesting information, very helpful genealogical information. Okay, so now we move away from primary sources to secondary sources. So these are not necessarily recorded at the time of the event, or they're recorded by someone that is distant from the facts. They're helpful. They can build a story. They corroborate information, but by themselves should be thought of as suspect. Okay, some of these include census. Now, the federal census is done, as you know, on the zeros, and many states have censuses that were done usually on the 5s. So luckily in New York, I have the New York census, and it was done in 1885, 1895, and so on. So I have information on my families for every 5 years, no matter where they live. There is also something called a city directory. It was created before phone books were created, and it is a list by last name of everybody that lives in the city. Again, this is only for big cities, but it would have the last name, then the first name, the wife's name in parentheses, and the street address, and then the occupation, what occupation the person was. So that's very good to find if a person lived in a particular area, because sometimes when they're, I showed you those death notices, they may have lived in one place for a long, long time and moved away for just a year or two. And then when they die, their death certificate is not where they lived the longest. The death certificate is in the municipality where they died. So you have to find that death certificate, you have to know the location where they were living upon their death. Sometimes they go and live with one of their children towards the end of their life, even if it's just for a couple of months. And so you'll be looking and looking in a city, wondering where the record is, and it's because it is where they died. Baptismal certificates, and I say that because a baptismal certificate may reference the date of birth, but that's not its primary purpose. Its primary purpose is to record when the child was christened. So the birth date on a baptismal certificate can be a little faulty. Also, there's obituaries, other newspaper articles, death cards. In America, we used a lot of death cards. There's insurance paperwork and business paperwork, which are often filed in local historical societies and can become quite interesting. But we're not going to go into them too much today. Today, again, we're going to look at just these bolded cases. So here is the census records. It's a big table. The census taker would go out. They were bound by certain rules to do it on certain days. They took an entire street and they went to every address one after another. All the records for 1890 were destroyed in a giant fire. It wasn't so much the fire, they used so much water to put out the fire that the water destroyed the paper records. So the 1890 census was destroyed. And again, in my case, I can use the 1885 and 1895 New York State census, and I can rebuild people's lives, because if they were somewhere in 1885 and then 1895, then you know that in 1890 they were in about the same place. So there were some books that were out of the main depository when the fire happened. So there are parts of 3 or 4 states that, if you're lucky enough to be part of those states, those still exist, but most of them were destroyed. But the census records are very helpful. Again, the census records won't mention the exact town, but in a house, you might have someone living in the upstairs apartment and someone living in the downstairs apartment, and they might be related. And that lets you get to, if you run into a brick wall with your own family, you can look at other families that are nearby. Twice in my family, one of the people living in the front apartment ends up falling in love with the woman that lives in the back apartment, and then magically you have family created by a living condition. So here's that city directory. Here's my the Biedny family in Buffalo, and as I said, it says this is my great uncle Tony. He was a baker. He lived on Shutram Street, and his sister was a bakery worker, and she lived right next door. And then this is my father. He was a draftsman, and I know that he started at a firm, but I never knew the name of the firm until after he died. And he was in the rear apartment at 80 Shutram, and Stanley Biedny, which is his grandfather, and this is Vince, which is my grandfather. So yes, my grandfather and his brother both married women named Stella. So there are Stella Biednys all over records of Buffalo, and you have to sort out which one it was, because they're both related to me, but one's a little closer than the other. And this one says that my grandfather worked at the American Optical Company, and he lived at 80 Shutram. So these city directories are quite interesting and quite helpful, especially if you're looking for other relatives with the same last name in the same area at the same time. And these came out every single year. So you could, this is 1952, but the Buffalo city directories, I believe, started in like 1904 or something like that. So you have almost 50 years of continuous where you can track people as they move around and change apartments and so on. So this is, I mentioned, so this is my father, this is my grandfather, Stanley is my great-grandfather. And when Stanley came to America, his father had a birth certificate and he had it folded up in his what do you call pocket, so you could see the stains. And this is in Gothic German. He was born in 1875, but before he got on the ship, he had this recorded in 1901. So this is a 1901 transcription of his 1875 birth, and it's from the German records office. This is not a church document. This is from the records office. So they have this standard Gothic German form, basically, and they fill out the form. And if you get good at this handwriting, you can see that Obergerge is the town right here on the birth certificate, where you could find other church records associated with the town. So this is not a parish record, but it's from the town information. Here is my grandfather Vince. This is his baptismal certificate. This one was made out in 1906 when he was baptized. This was an extraction. He was 15 years old, so he was getting his first job. So he needed to prove when he was baptized or born. And in 1906, you did not have to record your birth in New York, in the state of New York, in the city of Buffalo. You did not have to record that by law. It didn't start until 1908, I believe. So to prove to his employer that he was 15 and was able to work, he had to get this certificate extracted from his church. And then you'll see this Peter Laskowski is his godfather. That was his mother's brother-in-law. And this Peter down here, Peter married, was my great-grandmother's younger sister is who he married. And this Michalina Price, this is a Polish spelling, but later you see it spelled Price, like Price is Right. And Michalina was married to one of the brothers. So these names in the sponsors is very important because they bring you, I would say most of the time they were family members. You see on TV where godparents are often good friends and so on. If people didn't have a lot of relatives in America, they could have been good friends. But boy, if they had a relative, they were probably on the baptismal certificate as a sponsor.
These are brand new, saved for this show. No one's seen them debut. They're only order of the year. All NYDJ on QVC ships for free. And these are $109 jeans, $79 just
I
for the
think
next
someone's
hour.
television is on.
Colors and sizes, because then once we sell out and things start to sell out, and they will sell out.
Sorry, Kathy, we're taking you off. Kathy must have went to the restroom or something and left her TV on. So this is John Fida again, my grandmother's father, and this is a death notice that was in the newspaper, and it lists his children and where they lived. And then this is actually where he was buried. And if you go to this giant cemetery, there is paperwork for who bought the gravestone. And sometimes on that paperwork, it's mentioned where the person was originally born. So that's quite interesting. Now I mentioned you can't always believe everything that you see in print. So my great-grandfather, Stanley Biedny, did die in an accident, but it wasn't Didney. His last name is Biedny. He wasn't 61, he was 51. The people they used the death notice and they did the math wrong. He didn't live at 18 Queen Street. He lived on 18 Coons Avenue, but you could see if you were writing that, Coons could look like Queen, depending on how you made the capital letter. And then he died in the hospital of, and this says where he was the Hall Brick Company. They make fire bricks, and there was a fire, and his clothes ignited, they say here, but he did not, he had shoveled all his life. He did not die of catching on fire. He died of that gangrene. So complications resulted and death followed. So there's no OSHA back then, so we don't really know what happened. We probably never will, but I had to send the poor young man to I was in Minnesota, and I was sending to Buffalo, and I said, you have to find this burn thing. I know it was in the newspaper. My grandmother told me it was in the newspaper, but we can't find it. He looked off and on for about 3 weeks until he read every story, and he said, well, this is a Stanley, and the last name is kind of like yours. And so he finally sent it to me, and I gave him a big tip. Here is Stanley's death card. So this is the notice that would have been in the local newspaper. We had a Polish daily newspaper, so this is all in Polish. And then this is his wife, Margaret, who died in 1948. He died in 1925. She died in 1948. And this is a Polish card that you would have gotten at the funeral home. And my grandmother Stella had a whole collection of these cards. That's why I have the exact burial place for dozens of people in my family, because my grandmother obsessed about these cards. So she organized them and kept them in her prayer books. Here is this Margaret, the woman that died in 1948. Her last name is reported here as Biedny because her husband had died, and she took the female reckoning of the name again. And it's very hard to see here, but it actually has the apartment she was living on at 69 Shutram Street, and it has her weight, 215 pounds, which I'm sure she didn't really want people to know about, and certainly didn't think that anybody 120 years later would be talking about. But this was one of those ration cards. So on the inside were the little tickets for you to get sugar and gasoline and so on. But something as weird as that, my cousin had it in a pile of junk paper she was going to throw away. And I said, oh, because her mother lived with my great-grandmother later in life. And I said, no, this is really important. I'm gonna scan it and show people all over the country. And then they were pretty interested. So okay, and then here's some stabs in the dark. These are official or unofficial records that are kept for non-genealogical reasons, but often with no hard dates, but give you a lot of historical context and clues. Okay, so what is he talking about? So there's photos. Obviously, check the back of the photos. You can see people that are related to each other. And the photo might say Uncle George from Norway or whatever. It might be on the back. Unfortunately, I know you have seen lots and lots of family photos that do not have everything on the back in nice pencil. But boy, if you find it, it's great. Fraternal and civic organizations, address books. I have the address books for my grandmother, my parents, and my wife's parents. And the address books are very interesting because sometimes it'll say uncle such and so or aunt such and so in the book. So that's very helpful. Funeral books, I'll give you an example of that. Parish and anniversary books. Parishes had their 50th anniversaries, and sometimes they had lengthy articles, and depending on how much money you gave to the church, you could get quite a family history on those pages. And sometimes it mentioned where most of the people from a certain town came to a certain parish, and you can start there. There's also military histories, which are a little bit less useful for finding town names, but it's certainly gives you context of where the people were, and especially if they were in Europe. Okay, so here's just a quick example. So this is that Margaret, the woman that I said died in 1948. You just saw her card from the war stamps. Well, this was it stuck in the book you sign when you go to visit somebody at the funeral, right? So the undertaker used it to put the limousines together for her ride to the cemetery. Now, in the limousine was her daughter Celia and her son Vince and his wife Stella, which was my grandmother, and then her daughter Veronica, who was married to this Stephen Ratajczyk, and her son Ronald. They were the closest related to her, so they were in the limousine. Then the next closest were her brothers and sisters and brother-in-laws, and so on and so forth. I was able to check all sorts of information that I had and misspellings of people's names and so on, just from this information. It's not in her paperwork that would have went to the newspaper. It's very interesting, and it was never meant to be a genealogical piece of information, but luckily somebody kept it. Okay, before we jump off and go to some of the European sources, I just wanted to mention that the internet nowadays is just full of real interesting information. For Minnesota, the naturalization papers are all held at the Minnesota Historical Society. They've kept them from the 1850s to about 1940. You use an index, which is available from the Iron Range Research Center up in Ely, I believe. And then when you find a relative, you can get the actual record from the Minnesota Historical Society for $15. I know it was taking about 2 months in the middle of COVID, so now hopefully it's a little faster. But the Research Center has a database which will search all of the files, and you can filter it by different names and different dates. It's just wonderful. So that's a great place to start for that naturalization information that will have the town name on it, almost certainly. The federal court records are also held regionally. They're held in Chicago or Kansas City, depending on what part of the state and what time period you're in. And then the Minnesota Historical Society has a huge collection of local photographs and other things that are sometimes helpful to place people. And then one of my favorite sites in America is the Polish Genealogical Society of America. They have, I think over 800 or 1,000 members. So they have the money coming in to have a really good webmaster that keeps everything updated. And the links are all updated, and they're very focused on Polish research and Polish websites in America, here and in Poland. Okay, we're about halfway through, and I'll pick up the pace a little bit. There is hope, I want to say, in Poland for primary sources. They were not all lost during the war. Although some towns were completely wiped out, their records, they always had to send a second copy to the diocese. So the diocesan archives often has the record books if the churches don't have them anymore. They are not hard to read. They're often in Latin, and they're written in a good priest's hand mostly. And they're not all Catholic. There are Lutheran settlements in northern Germany, and the Jews kept their own records, and those are available, some of them online. Most of what I've done has been put online by the Mormons. So the Mormon Church, as a tenet of their faith, believes that people can be baptized into their religion even if they are dead. So they have gone all over the world photocopying and microfilming birth and death records, and then they brought them back to Salt Lake, and in years past they would actually send you a copy of the microfilm tape out to a local, they don't have parishes or churches, they have, it's called a stake, S-T-A-K-E. So you'd go to your local stake, and in the basement somewhere they'd have a viewer, and you could view the tapes, and it was usually opened a couple of evenings a week, and maybe one day during the week. And you could view the tapes there. You couldn't own them. You were basically renting it from them, but it's as if you were in the Polish archives. You had the first hand work, and those are now being put online. However, when the Polish records were filmed, there was nothing like the internet. So the terms of the agreement to share the files never included online. And now that the archives in Poland want to make their money on the information, they're really not keen about the Mormons giving it away for free. So you can get them, you can do the research. Sometimes you have to go to a special library that's in concert with the Mormons, or you have to go to Salt Lake City. But you can't just, like Ancestry.com, you can't sit at home and do this research from your desktop computer, unfortunately. So the keeping of everyone's vital records is relatively a new phenomenon. For centuries, the only way you ended up in the records were if you had broken the law or if you owned land, which was recorded in tax rolls and transferred through wills and in the court system. But vital records, as we know it, came to Europe in the 1500s during the Reformation. So once the Reformation happened and the Protestants started keeping track of who they were, by the 1600s, all the Catholic parishes were actively keeping track of their birth, marriage, and death records. So this required the creation of the use of last names, which up until then, I mean, you could have just been Paul from Obercherja. You didn't need a last name. And so the last names were created, and then by the reforms in Austria in the late 1700s and the Napoleonic reforms of the 1810s, the vital record keeping got easier, more consistent, and a lot easier to read. So, of course, everybody on this call should know about the partitions of Poland. When people from our ancestors when they came here, mostly between 1880 and 1920, the First World War, they were coming from a country that did not exist. They would have been listed as subjects of the Russian Tsar or the Austrian Emperor or the Prussian, by then it would have been Germany. But so the paperwork might say that they were not Polish, but if they spoke Polish at home and went to a Polish church and went to confession and was heard in Polish, they would have considered them Polish by culture at least. So I think it was easier for them to swear off allegiances. Sometimes in the paperwork, people will say Silesia or Poznan or Warsaw, but again, chances are you did not come from Poznan or the big city of Warsaw. You came from some small town in that general area. My family comes from the Poznan area, and unfortunately, it's kind of like New York. New York is a city and it's a region. Poznan is a city and a region. So you're never quite sure when they say Poznan, but I come from many small towns north of Poznan within 20 miles. So it's kind of like saying you're from the Midwest or New York or Los Angeles. You have to be a little bit more specific. It's better to know that you're from Bloomington or Rogers or Sartell or some other small town. So you can start with a smaller set of information. So the occupying powers kept great maps of their holdings so that they could defend them. I mean, we were dealing with Austria, Prussia, and
Russia.
Germany and Russia, and they were three of the most aggressive monarchies in all of Europe, all at the same time. So the Prussians and the Austrians did wonderful maps, and we benefit from those. There's also this gazetteer called the Słownik Geograficzny, and it's 15,000 entries that have small towns. So here on the left-hand side is the entry in Polish. It was published in Poland from 1895 to 1905. It's a 20-some volume set, and on the left-hand side you can see lots of abbreviations. but the beginning of the book has all of these abbreviations settled. So then you can, when you translate it, you can translate it as I've done here on the right-hand side. So it has wonderful information. It talks about usually when the church in the town was founded, when the town was founded, who might have owned it, how many houses they had, how many people they had. Sometimes it's the religion of the people, sometimes it's so many men, so many women. It isn't always consistent, but it gives you a lot of great information about the town. By the way, that is available online now. They used to sell a CD-ROM of it, but it is now available online. It's kind of cumbersome because it's so much easier when you're reading tiny little things like that to deal with the book itself. So here is the little town of Khrushchevo. I mentioned that this was on one of the naturalization papers. So Khrushchevo, there's down in the valley and up on the hill. And the church is down in the valley, and my family was up on the hill. And when we visited, the pastor said, go on this road until it ends. You'll go through a small forest, and then you'll go through some fields, and then the road ends, and that's where the Fidas live. And sure enough, we drove up this one-lane concrete road and got to the top and went through a field and went through a small forest, and it ended up at the farmstead. And so very interesting. Lots of stories to be told about that too. So they were very helpful and very open, and it was actually a Polish festival. There was a festival at the parish, and the woman was making pickles to sell at the festival later that week. So I stopped her from making pickles. I think she was happy that I came to visit. So this map is from a modern road map. So you kind of see the big buildings. All these little squares are buildings. Well, this is the Austrian military map of that same area. Not only does it show this beautiful topography, but every one of these little squares is a building. It's an actual building. And this is the valley that has most of the buildings in it, including the church. And then I came up this big hill. I mean, I could practically tell you exactly where the road was. And then we got to the top of the hill where the people lived, and then their farm fields were all around them. So wonderful detail in the maps. Go ahead. Khrushcheva. This is a L with a cross through it. Khrushcheva. So this is my great relative Veronica. Veronica was in her gardening in her front yard, and the priest told us where to go, and we found her, and we had a lovely conversation. And then we said, well, Veronica, we want to have your picture taken with us. And she said, oh, I can't be in my gardening clothes. So she went inside and she put on her dress and washed up a little bit. And she is behind the house that my family immigrated from. The brown side is the animals and the blue side is the house. And there's a breezeway in between, and very interesting. And this is, again, south central Poland. So there is already the Onion Dome and the architectural influences. This is a Roman Catholic church, but it already has the architectural influences of Orthodox that you will find 25 miles to the east. It already becomes Eastern Orthodox. So the church there's a new concrete church that's air conditioned across the street, but they keep the old church because it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. They were actually given money by the government of Europe to renovate and keep the building going. So very, very interesting. So here's Obergerge. This is my father's side of the family. I just showed you one side, the Fidas side. This is the Biedny side. This is a long, thin lake that I've seen on maps for many, many years. This is a modern map. All of these towns with the lines under them is where my family comes from. This is the church. And this is maybe a 40-minute walk, and this is maybe a miles walk or a 1 hour walk to church, but that's very close. And then this Oborniki is kind of the regional town, and just off the page here would be Poznan to the south. This is a German Empire map. Again, it's as detailed as the Austrian one, as I showed you before. Here is the marshland that is a mill pond, a lake that is held back to run a mill pond. And then here are all those same small towns that I had underlined before. They're just outlined in blue. So we were there in the summer, and to see the actual lake is pretty amazing. It's not very deep, it's not very wide, it's probably a couple miles long. And it was just wonderful to be there and see it in person. You get a great sense of your history when you can actually stand where your relatives had stood before you. So this is a close-up of the town, and it has this beautiful brick church and a palace. The landed gentry had a palace here, and it has a lot of very interesting history. But normally, when you drive through Poland now, many of these regional palaces, they were allowed to fall into ruin. The roof is caved in, or all the windows are smashed, and because the communists built communist block buildings to run the farm that this sat on. So they would farm it collectively, and they didn't use the house. They let it go to pot, and but this one luckily is in beautiful condition because it was used as a boys' school in the late 1800s, and even through the First World War it was maintained. So it exists now as a boys' boarding school. Okay, so now if you are able to find the town information, you have unlocked the key to baptismal, marriage, and death records. And as I mentioned there, I have had records back into the 1600s with my family name in them. The difficult part is in the 1700s, sometimes some of the books are missing. So you can't do it's almost impossible to do an unbroken lineage all the way back from person to person to person, because once you get into the 1700s, things get a little freaky. But to say that you're in a town and that last name has been in the town since the 1600s gives you a sense of interest and purpose. Peasants did not move around a lot. They had a little bit more money in the German partition later in the history of Poland. They were a little more mobile, but most peasants stayed very close to home, married close to home, died close to home. They're not far ranging. So if you find the baptismal records, they can confirm a birth date and they can confirm the parents. The Austrian records actually also list the grandparents and the towns that they were from. So very, very interesting. Once I did about 120 years of research, going back 120 years one afternoon, with the right information from the right town in the Austrian partition. I was able to find a person, their parents, then their grandparents, and because the parents' ages and the person's ages were mentioned, you can go back another step and find their birth certificate and just go back and back and back because of them having the three generations on the record. Okay, this looks very scary, but this is a paragraphal form of a birth certificate. They get easier later. I'll show you ones that are in columns, but this is a paragraph, and it's very difficult when you get the right lighting and you can control the brightness and darkness. You start picking out the people's names, and the parish priest went and underlined them. So at least the child's name is underlined, and then the person's last name is underlined. So if you scan it, you can see that this is Joseph Biedny's birth certificate, and Anton Biedny was his father, and his wife Antonina is mentioned here in this piece of the record. So, but this was my Stanley Biedny, the man that came to America. This was his older brother, Joseph, that stayed in Poland. So, so this is a little brighter image of that same. This is the name of the town. This is the date. This is his name. He was born in 1865, and he was born to Antonio. And then, oh, at the very end, it has his godparents, Antonio Pisa, which would have been Francesca's older brother, and this Amelia Komowitz. And I don't know, I haven't found out how she's related to me yet, Amelia Komowitz. So, marriage records, excellent information. Usually some of the German partition information, they did not even have parents listed, which made it very difficult. But this is done more in a paragraph or a column format. So you have the number of the occurrence. So this is just a continuing number for each year. So this one would have been the third marriage of the year. And this is Vince Fida right here, and his wife, Sophia, here. And then it has the people who were the sponsors, John Bishop and another person here. And it also mentions that there were Ruslika, so they were country folk. This is their, if you were noble, they would put noble, and there's several different levels of peasantry, and if you were of a higher peasantry, they would put something else there, but here they're recording you as rustic country folk. This is the marriage of that Tony Biedny and Francisca Pisa, the people that were parents that had that child just one year later. So this is Joseph, and it mentions his parents. Oh, I'm sorry, this is a different marriage. I'm going to show you the marriage of Anton Biedny and Francisca Pisa. This is the one that's mentioned on the birth certificate from a long time ago. This is Antonius Biedny here and Francisca Pisa here. And then it lists the bands of marriage when they were announced in the church. And then it has the godparents as well. And the town that they're from, which is just here. It looks like a scribble, but it is, once you start knowing the towns to look for, they kind of pop out at you. Death notices. They're helpful, but people did not keep very good records, and they weren't very good at math. So people tend to die when they're exactly with a number that ends in 0, or exactly when a number ends in 5. Or sometimes they'll just say very old. So it's not that helpful. If it says the person was 80 years old, you can't always just subtract from 80 and count them that was their birth date. You really want to find some other information. It also helps with the death of very small children, because quite often you'll go through birth records and you'll count 10 different children, and then you'll try to find the adults. You'll try to find them as adults, and many of them died as children. So the death records can help you cut people out of your family off the list because they died young. So this is such a case. This is Rosalia Biedny's death certificate from 1829. She was 6 years old, and I think I have a better one here. So here's the town name again. This is Rosalia, and she was the child of Andreas Biedny. The other thing that gets you crazy is they hyphenate. This is BIE, and then down here they did DNY. Why didn't you just go down below and write it all as one? But no, they break it up into pieces. So Biedny and Catherine Zadorka, which is his wife. So and they lived, and then she died when she was 6 years old. So this is not always in a column, but So there's also vital records. There are civil registries, and I mentioned to you that one birth certificate you saw in 1875 in Germany. They started the Germanification of the Polish areas. They outlawed anything spoken in Polish except in church. They didn't use the church records anymore as the official ones. They set up their own civil registry offices, and they purposely usually went out of an area that had a church to a totally different town, and you paid a small tax to have your civil things registered. But there are much of the civil registry information is online and available now at the archives in Poland. So this is kind of a shadow to everything else that I've showed you. There is another set of information, but unfortunately, this record system only started in 1875. So, and then of course, when Poland became a country again, after the First World War, in the interwar period, there were people that did come from Poland, and so this is a Polish passport from 1923. It is my great-grandfather's second wife. His first wife died in childbirth, and so here comes Mrs. Perfinchuk. And what's interesting here is it's in Polish and French, because French was the international language. So you have the date of birth and color of hair and all that kind of stuff in both Polish and French. So if you know Polish and French, this is helpful. But I even have a picture of her eventually, and it matched everything that was said in here. There are other judicial information. There are wills and probates. There are cadastral holdings, and I'll show you a picture of that. There's also civil and criminal actions and records. I would suggest if you get to this level, you get a professional from Poland to be able to sift through the information. Even if you read Polish naturally, it's difficult to go through the old criminal records because they are using words that aren't used nowadays. So it's better to get a professional researcher. And there are now more and more professional researchers in Poland. There are kids going through college and having a history degree or a research degree, and then they get out and they either form their own little company, or they join an established company and they do research for people all the time. So very well priced and approachable, and you know the money goes to a good cause. And so if you get this deep into it, I just want to mention this one cadastral map. So the holdings of a lord were kept in these cadastral maps. So all of his land ownings were mapped this way, and they were showed the long, thin strips of land that were used for farming, and they were numbered, and then the numbers were chained to a family member, and then the family member was given how much they had to pay, and whether or not the land was transferable from the obligation was transferable from father to son. So you can see on this one, especially back here, it looks like just these long, thin ribbons. And I wasn't much of a farmer, so I had to have somebody explain it to me. But obviously, if you have a draft animal, you want to be able to plow a furrow moving forward as much as possible. You don't want to have to come and turn around very often, because that takes extra time and energy of that draft animal. So it's best to draw in long, thin strips. But in a small town, you might have one holding here, and then after dinner or the next day, you have to go to another one in a different location, because they're separated. They're not in nice little squares like American has 160 acres and it's a square. That's not how Poland is laid out. Okay, before I leave, I just wanted to mention some of the great internet resources. There is a site called the Poznan Project. There was a professor in Poland that said, hey, why look through all of these birth records? Because the birth records, many of the people die. And most of them, if they get married and then have a family, you can tie it to the record. So this indexes all the marriages in the Poznan area from 1800 to 1900 roughly. And when it first started, you never thought that they would finish it. But in 20 years, they've done a tremendous job of getting every single little town, with very few exceptions, every single little town in the Poznan area for 100 years, there is a marriage index. So if that's the other way to find a town, if you don't know a town, but you know they were from the Poznan area, you can go to the Poznan marriage index, put in the two last names, especially if you know the correct first and last names, look for a marriage record, and then work backwards as to where the marriage record was recorded. The marriage record itself is not available from the Poznan project. It's only an index, but it will point you to the archives or Polish archives or the diocesan archives that has the information, and then you can get it from them. In Greater Poland, there's also this PACIM. It's a place, another website. This is yet a third website. The National Archives of Poland is divided into multiple different pieces, and each archive has its better. They're almost in a race to get information online, and so it's neat. And most of the archives are translatable from English to Polish, so you just press the button in the right-hand corner with the American flag, and it'll change the website into English. And then I call it the Fabulous Four, but these are mostly paid sites. So Family Search is not. Family Search is the Mormons, and they're at familysearch.com. I'm a member of Ancestry. There is a company called Find My Past, and then My Heritage. I mentioned I have my DNA on the site, but I'm not a card-paying member. My Heritage, not only can you put a website there like you can with Ancestry, they're giving you lots of other tools. My Heritage right now has this thing where it will colorize a black and white photo. It'll take a colored photo that's faded, and it will automatically, I do that using a paintbrush and some other software that I have. But you don't even have to understand that software. You just tie it in, and My Heritage will make it beautiful. So I guess it would be worth, if you had a lot of photos and you wanted to do something like that, you could become a short-term member for maybe 3 months and get all of your photographic work done, and then jump off the site. But very, very interesting work. I hope you learned a little bit about this process. Hope springs eternal. And as I said, the records in America usually takes an hour, and the records in Poland usually takes another hour, but I combine them all into this presentation to hopefully get us done in about an hour. And if you have questions, I think I have one more slide. Oh, just final thoughts on going to Europe. I would strongly recommend it. You don't have to have relatives there. You'll go there and you'll feel like you had relatives. Every time I saw a woman sitting on a bus bench, I swore she was one of my great aunts, because they all look alike and they all smile back at you, and it was wonderful. And you could do research. You could get the research done by others, or you could do it yourself. And paying people in Poland is not a difficult thing to do anymore. You can do it. Many of them do it with PayPal. You don't have to send money through a bank. In fact, that's an expensive way to do it. But so I will go back here and stay ready for your question. I think you can unmute yourself, and if you can't, just raise your hand and I'll unmute you for you. I know I threw a lot of things at you, but
where does one find records before 1860 in the northwestern part of Poland? Besides the website I've put in the chat.
Before 1860,
Right.
There there should be church records at the parish level. Now, that part of Poland, of course, was German, and then Polish, and then after the Second World War, it became specifically Polish. So there is a group called the Pomeranian Society here in Minnesota. They have a whole different genealogical group, and some of them are very well versed in German because more of those records will be in German. So you might want to look up the Pomeranian group, depending on how far north and west you go in Poland today. You would be in Pomerania or the parts of Germany that was given to Poland after the Second World War.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Where my relatives are, I'm probably only 50 miles away from having that problem. Luckily, I'm solidly closer to Poznan, and then I don't have the problem with the German records. A part of Polish history was the Polish landowners invited entire towns from Germany and Dutch towns and the Netherlands. They would come and create a town or actually a little village or a hamlet, improve the productivity of the person's land, and then they would allow them to be colonists on his property. So they could keep their religion. So that's how we got Protestants in the midst of all those Catholics, and they could keep their language. So we until they intermarried over the centuries, you had little tiny hamlets that spoke Dutch or had their records in their Protestant church. So that has a realize that could happen in some of the records. They'll be called colony, meaning that at some point their families came from another part of Europe and colonized in Poland. Anything else? Well, it was my great pleasure to keep you informed for an hour, and I thank you. And next time we could get a little bit more specific, but today was more like drinking out of a fire hose.
Thank you
you.
so much.
You're welcome. Phyllis.
Jay, so excellent information. And our plan is to create a link between the Zoom recording and PACIM website so that people can review this, watch it again, or if they missed it, watch it in future. And this jvbjr250@gmail.com, is that you?
That's me. Yep.
And is it okay if people email you questions?
Sure.
Or
No, that's why I
Okay.
put it up there. So I might not get back to you right away. I don't check this email. I usually check it only on the weekends, but I will reply. I don't do research for you, but I will point you in the right direction.
That sounds great.
Everybody, that's the one thing. Everybody thinks that the information online that someone else does is good about their family. And I would say, well, you are the best person to do the research on your family because it's your family. So if you start clipping branches off of other people's trees, you're going to end up with oranges and lemons on your apple tree. So you don't want that.
Beautiful. Anybody else? Okay, well, Phyllis, Paul, Dorothy, Kathy, and Miatek, thank you for being here. And Jay, thank you so much for presenting.
Very well. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.